Sarah White's reflection vanished on a cold January morning in 1833. The mirror that hung above Mrs. Helena Pennington's vanity showed everything in that Charleston bedroom except the young enslaved girl who stood directly before it, her hands still gripping the silver brush she used each dawn to prepare her mistress's hair. The trunk beside the vanity, the one with the brass lock and mother-of-pearl inlay, had somehow sealed itself shut during the night. When the household finally pried it open 3 days later, they found only Sarah's work apron folded neatly inside and a single handprint pressed deep into the wooden interior of the lid, as though someone had pushed against it from within with desperate force. Sarah herself was never seen again, but the servants whispered that on certain nights, when the moon hung full over the harbor, they could hear someone crying softly from inside that locked trunk, begging to be let out. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The Pennington house stood on King Street, 3 stories of white-painted brick with black shutters and a wrought iron fence that separated the family's prosperity from the dusty street beyond. It was one of the finest homes in Charleston's fashionable district, built with money that flowed from rice plantations spread across the low country like a plague. Helena Pennington had inherited the house from her father, along with 12 enslaved people who kept the household running with invisible efficiency. Among them was Sarah White, just 17 years old in that winter of 1833, with dark eyes that seemed to hold more intelligence than her station was supposed to allow. Sarah had been born in the quarters behind the main house, daughter to a woman named Ruth who had died of fever when Sarah was only 8. After that, she had been raised by the other enslaved women in the household, learning the intricate dance of servitude that kept white families comfortable and ignorant of the suffering that made their comfort possible. By the time she turned 12, Sarah had been assigned to personal service for Mrs. Pennington, a position that some considered fortunate because it meant working indoors, away from the brutal sun and the fields that broke bodies and spirits with equal cruelty. But proximity to Helena Pennington came with its own particular torments. The mistress was a woman of 35 who had married well but loved poorly, whose husband Benjamin spent most of his time at his gentleman's club or in the arms of women who were not his wife. Helena channeled her disappointment into an obsessive focus on her appearance and social standing, and Sarah bore the weight of these obsessions every single day. If Sarah was slow in arranging Helena's hair, she received sharp words or sometimes a slap. If the tea was too hot or too cold, if the dress buttons were not fastened perfectly, if the room was not arranged exactly as Helena wished, Sarah paid the price in 100 small cruelties that never left visible marks but carved deep wounds into her spirit nonetheless. The mirror had arrived at the Pennington house in late December of 1832. Delivered by a merchant ship from France, it was an ornate piece with a gilded frame carved to resemble intertwined roses and thorns, and it had cost Benjamin Pennington a sum that could have purchased 3 enslaved people at the market. Helena had placed it above her vanity with tremendous satisfaction, spending hours each day studying her reflection and directing Sarah to experiment with different hairstyles and cosmetics until everything met her exacting standards. The trunk had arrived with the mirror, a matching piece from the same French craftsman. It was smaller than most storage trunks, perhaps 3 feet long and 2 feet deep, made of dark walnut wood with those distinctive brass fittings and mother-of-pearl decorations set into the lid in swirling patterns. Helena had declared it perfect for storing her most delicate undergarments and jewelry, things she did not trust to the larger wardrobes where other servants might have access. She gave Sarah responsibility for keeping the trunk organized, for folding each item precisely and arranging the jewelry in the small velvet-lined compartments built into the trunk's interior. January in Charleston was cold that year, with winds blowing in from the Atlantic that rattled the shutters and made the enslaved people huddle close to whatever fires they were permitted. Sarah would wake in the small room off the kitchen where she slept, wrap herself in the thin blanket that was her only protection against the chill, and climb the stairs to Helena's bedroom an hour before dawn. Her tasks began in darkness, lighting the fire, preparing the water for washing, laying out Helena's clothes for the day, and always tending to that mirror and trunk. On the morning of January 15th, 1833, Sarah noticed something strange. She had arrived in Helena's room as usual, moving quietly so as not to wake her mistress, who still slept behind the heavy curtains of the four-poster bed. Sarah lit the candles around the vanity and began her routine of dusting and organizing. But when she happened to glance into the mirror, she saw something impossible. The reflection showed the room behind her perfectly. The bed with its burgundy curtains, the wallpaper with its pattern of gold and cream, the window with its view of the garden below. But where Sarah herself should have appeared in the glass, there was simply emptiness, as though she were a ghost too insubstantial to cast a reflection. Sarah stepped back, her heart beginning to pound in her chest. She moved to the left, then to the right, but the mirror refused to acknowledge her presence. It reflected everything else with perfect clarity, but showed only blank space where she stood. She raised her hand to touch her face, to confirm that she was still solid and real. And in the glass she saw no hand, no arm, nothing at all. A cold sensation crept up her spine, something beyond the chill of the January morning, something that felt like the touch of another world pressing close against her own. Behind her, Helena stirred in the bed, making a small sound of complaint at being disturbed. Sarah quickly composed herself and went about her duties, trying to ignore what she had seen, or rather what she had not seen. Perhaps the mirror had a flaw in its glass, she told herself. Or perhaps the candlelight was playing tricks in the pre-dawn darkness. But throughout that day, whenever she caught a glimpse of the mirror, the same impossibility persisted. Helena's reflection appeared perfectly. The room reflected with absolute accuracy. But Sarah remained invisible to the glass, a servant rendered even more transparent than her social position already demanded. That evening, as Sarah prepared Helena for bed, her mistress was in a particularly foul mood. Benjamin had failed to come home for dinner again, and Helena had spent the afternoon receiving visitors who whispered behind their fans about his rumored infidelities. She sat at the vanity while Sarah brushed her hair with long, careful strokes. But nothing Sarah did seemed adequate to Helena's expectations. The brush pulls were too hard or too soft. The pace was too quick or too slow. Finally, Helena snatched the brush from Sarah's hands and threw it across the room, where it struck the wall with a sharp crack. "Useless!" Helena hissed, her face twisted with an anger that had nothing to do with Sarah and everything to do with a life that had disappointed her in countless ways. "You are absolutely useless to me. I should have you sold to the rice fields where you belong." Sarah stood with her head bowed, hands clasped in front of her, knowing that any response would only make things worse. She had learned long ago that the safest path through Helena's rages was silence and stillness, becoming as much like furniture as possible until the storm passed. But inside, something was changing. The strange absence of her reflection had unsettled something deep within her, had made her aware of herself in a new and uncomfortable way. She felt as though she were disappearing not just from the mirror but from the world itself, erased by the daily grinding away of her humanity that servitude required. "Get out of my sight," Helena finally said, waving her hand in dismissal. "And make sure that trunk is properly organized before you go to bed. I noticed this morning that my pearls were not arranged correctly." Sarah retrieved the brush from where it had fallen and returned it to the vanity. As she did, she glanced once more into the mirror and saw Helena's reflection glaring at her. Saw the room behind reflected in perfect detail. but still no trace of herself. It was as though the mirror had decided she was not worthy of acknowledgement, that her existence was too insignificant to warrant reflection. The thought filled her with a strange mixture of anger and sorrow that she did not have words to express. She opened the trunk to check on the jewelry as Helena had ordered. The pearls were arranged exactly as they should be, of course, because Sarah was meticulous in her duties despite what her mistress believed. But as she looked at the contents of the trunk, at the silk undergarments and the jewels that represented more wealth than Sarah could hope to see in 10 lifetimes, she felt something shift inside her. Her hand touched the smooth wood of the trunk's interior, and for just a moment, she felt warmth radiating from it, as though the wood itself were alive and breathing. The sensation passed quickly, but it left Sarah unsettled. She closed the trunk and locked it with the small brass key that Helena kept on a ribbon around her neck during the day, and left on the vanity at night. Then she retreated to her small room off the kitchen, where she lay awake for hours listening to the house settle around her, and wondering what was happening to her reflection and why the thought of disappearing entirely did not frighten her as much as it should. The days that followed brought more strangeness. Sarah's reflection remained absent from the mirror, though no one else seemed to notice this impossibility. Helena looked into the glass 100 times each day without remarking on anything unusual, and when other servants passed by the mirror, their reflections appeared as normal. It was only Sarah who had been erased from its sight. She began to wonder if she were losing her mind, if the stress and degradation of her position were finally breaking something essential inside her consciousness. But there were other signs that something beyond madness was occurring. The trunk began to call to her, though call was not quite the right word for the sensation. It was more like a pull, a magnetic attraction that drew her attention whenever she was in Helena's room. She found herself touching it more often than her duties required, running her fingers along its brass fittings and tracing the mother-of-pearl patterns with a fascination she could not explain. Sometimes, when she pressed her palm flat against the lid, she felt that warmth again, and sometimes she thought she heard something like a heartbeat coming from deep within the wood. On January 20th, something happened that changed everything. Sarah was alone in Helena's room, organizing the mistress's clothes while Helena was downstairs receiving a visitor. Sarah had opened the trunk to put away some freshly laundered undergarments when she noticed something she had never seen before. At the bottom of the trunk, hidden beneath a false panel that Sarah had somehow triggered when she set down the clothes, there was a small book bound in black leather. Sarah knew she should not touch it. Reading was forbidden to enslaved people, and possessing a book could mean severe punishment or worse. But curiosity overcame caution, and she lifted the volume carefully from its hiding place. The cover bore no title, just a symbol pressed into the leather, a circle surrounding a keyhole with strange markings that might have been letters from a language Sarah did not recognize. She opened the book to the first page and found writing in English, though the hand was old-fashioned and difficult to decipher. The book appeared to be a journal, and as Sarah puzzled through the first entries, she realized it had been written by a woman named Marguerite Duchamp, the French craftsman's wife, the woman whose husband had created the mirror and trunk. The entries were dated from 1825 through 1828, and they told a story that made Sarah's blood run cold in her veins. Marguerite wrote of her husband's obsession with creating objects that could trap and hold things beyond the physical. He had been convinced that mirrors were doorways to other places, that reflective surfaces could be constructed in such a way as to capture not just light but something more essential, something of the soul itself. He had experimented for years, creating mirrors and containers that were linked together in some arcane way that Marguerite did not fully understand but deeply feared. He believes he can capture time itself, one entry read, in Marguerite's elegant script. He says that with the proper construction and the proper sacrifice, a person can step outside the flow of years and exist in a space between heartbeats where suffering cannot reach and death cannot find them. But I have seen what his experiments produce. I have seen the shadows that move in the mirrors when no one stands before them. I have heard the voices that call from within the sealed boxes he creates. This is not science. This is something darker, something that should be left alone. The journal detailed how Marguerite's husband had finally succeeded in creating a matched set, a mirror that could see into souls and a trunk that could hold them. He had meant to test the devices on a condemned criminal, Marguerite wrote, but before he could complete his experiment, he had died suddenly of a fever that consumed him in 3 days. Marguerite had wanted to destroy the mirror and trunk, but her husband's workshop had been seized by creditors and the objects had been sold before she could act. The journal's final entry was a warning. Whoever possesses these objects must beware. The mirror sees what is hidden. The trunk offers escape. But the price of escape is existence itself. Once someone enters the trunk's embrace, they step outside the world and cannot return unless they can remember why they wished to be part of it in the first place. Sarah sat on the floor beside Helena's vanity, the journal trembling in her hands, understanding flooding through her with terrible clarity. The mirror had stopped reflecting her because it was seeing something beyond her physical form. It was seeing her soul, her essential self, and finding that self already half erased by the brutal reduction of slavery. The trunk was offering her a way out, a door to somewhere beyond the reach of masters and mistresses, beyond the reach of pain and degradation. But the cost would be her existence itself, her presence in the world of material things and human connections. She heard footsteps on the stairs, Helena returning from her visit. Sarah quickly replaced the journal in its hiding place and closed the false bottom of the trunk. She stood and busied herself with folding clothes, her heart racing with the knowledge she now possessed. When Helena entered the room, Sarah kept her eyes down and her movements steady, giving no sign of the revelation that had shaken her to her core. That night, Sarah could not sleep. She lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about what the journal had revealed. The trunk was offering her escape, but into what? A void between moments, a space outside time where she would be free from suffering, but also free from everything else that made existence meaningful. It was a terrible choice, but Sarah could not stop thinking about it, could not stop imagining what it might be like to simply stop being. To let go of the weight of consciousness and slip into that space between heartbeats where Helena Pennington and Benjamin Pennington and the entire structure of Charleston society could not touch her. But there were things that held her to the world still. There was Esther, another enslaved girl in the household who had become like a sister to Sarah over the years. There was Moses, the elderly man who tended the garden and who had taught Sarah to recognize the plants that could heal and the ones that could harm. There were small moments of beauty that punctuated the suffering. The smell of jasmine in the spring, the sound of singing that rose from the quarters on Sunday evenings, the taste of stolen sweets from Helena's pantry, the brief touches and knowing glances exchanged with others who understood what it meant to be owned. January turned to February, and Sarah found herself caught between two worlds. During the days, she performed her duties with mechanical precision, but her mind was always elsewhere, always returning to the choice that the trunk represented. Her reflection remained absent from the mirror, and this seemed to Sarah like a sign that the decision was being made for her whether she willed it or not. She was already disappearing, already fading from the world's sight. Perhaps it would be easier to finish the process, to let the trunk swallow her completely and end the slow agony of erasure that slavery demanded. Helena noticed that something was different about Sarah, though she could not have said exactly what had changed. The girl was quieter than usual, more remote, as though her thoughts were very far away even as her hands continued their work. Helena found this disturbing in a way she could not articulate. She was accustomed to her servants being invisible, but Sarah's new quality was something beyond invisibility. It was as though the girl were becoming translucent, as though she were losing substance and solidity with each passing day. On the morning of February 3rd, Helena did something she had never done before. She asked Sarah a question that was not in order. "Are you unwell?" Helena said, studying Sarah's face in the mirror as the girl brushed her mistress's hair. "You seem changed lately." Sarah met Helena's eyes in the reflection, or rather, she looked at the space where Helena's eyes appeared in the glass, since Sarah herself still cast no reflection. "I am well, ma'am," Sarah said softly, "just tired." "You are always tired," Helena said, dismissing the answer. "All of you are always tired. That is not what I mean." She paused, seeming to struggle with something. "You seem distant, as though you are going away somewhere." The words struck Sarah like a physical blow because they were true in ways that Helena could not possibly understand. Sarah was going away, had been going away for weeks now, slipping bit by bit out of the world and toward that space the trunk offered. She wanted to tell Helena everything, wanted to explain about the mirror and the trunk and the choice she was facing. But how could she explain such things to the woman who owned her? How could she make Helena understand that the very structure of ownership had already pushed Sarah so far toward disappearance that the final step seemed almost inevitable? "I am here, ma'am," Sarah said instead. "I will always be here to serve you." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue because Sarah knew it was not true. She would not always be here. She could not always be here. Something had to change, had to break, had to give way beneath the weight of what she carried. And the trunk waited beside the vanity like a patient mouth, ready to swallow her whole. That evening, after Helena had gone to bed, Sarah returned to the bedroom. She told herself she was just checking that everything was in order for the morning, but she knew the truth. She was drawn back to the trunk, to the choice it represented, to the escape it promised. She lit a single candle and knelt beside the trunk, pressing her palms against its smooth surface. The warmth was stronger now, almost hot, and she could feel vibrations running through the wood like a purring cat or a beating heart. "What are you?" Sarah whispered to the trunk. "What do you want from me?" The trunk had no voice to answer, but Sarah felt its response nonetheless. It wanted nothing from her. It simply offered. The choice was hers alone to make, and it would wait as long as necessary for her decision. This was somehow worse than if the trunk had been trying to trick or trap her. A trap could be avoided, could be recognized and refused. But a genuine offer, a real choice, that was much harder to turn away from. Sarah opened the trunk using the key that Helena always left on the vanity. Inside were the familiar silks and jewels, beautiful things that represented the wealth built on suffering like hers. But now Sarah saw something else as well. At the very bottom of the trunk, beneath the false panel where the journal lay hidden, there was a faint glow, a light that seemed to come from within the wood itself. It was not bright, just a gentle phosphorescence like moonlight on water, but it illuminated the trunk's interior with an otherworldly radiance. Sarah reached toward the light, her fingers trembling. As her hand entered the trunk's space, she felt a sensation unlike anything she had experienced before. It was as though the air inside the trunk was different, thicker somehow and yet more yielding, like water that she could breathe. Her hand disappeared into that strange space, and for a moment Sarah felt nothing. No weight, no substance, just a floating sensation that might have been freedom or might have been dissolution. She could not tell which. She pulled her hand back quickly, her heart hammering in her chest. The sensation had been seductive and terrifying in equal measure. and Sarah understood with sudden clarity that if she let herself fall into that space, she would never come back. Not because she would be unable to return, but because she would not want to. The space inside the trunk was everything that her life was not: peaceful, timeless, free from pain and degradation, and the 1,000 daily humiliations that slavery demanded. It would be so easy to let go, to simply climb into the trunk and pull the lid closed behind her and drift away into that luminous void. But something held her back. Some stubborn core of self that refused to be erased, that insisted on existing even when existence meant suffering. Sarah closed the trunk and locked it, then sat on the floor beside it, crying silently in the candlelight. She wept for the girl she had been before slavery had marked her, for the woman she might have been in a different world, for all the possibilities that had been stolen from her before she was old enough to understand what was being taken. When her tears were spent, Sarah stood and wiped her face. She returned to her small room and lay down on her narrow bed, but sleep would not come. Her mind turned over and over the choice she faced, examining it from every angle, trying to find some path forward that did not require her to either accept endless suffering or abandon existence itself. But perhaps there was no third option. Perhaps this was the ultimate cruelty of her position: to be given a choice between two forms of death, one slow and one immediate, with no possibility of actual life available. The next morning, February 4th, 1833, Sarah woke with a strange sense of clarity. She went about her duties as usual, lighting the fire in Helena's room, preparing the water, laying out the clothes. But as she worked, she was aware of every moment in a way she had never been before, seeing each action with perfect attention as though she were memorizing it for a time when she would no longer be able to perform such tasks. She brushed Helena's hair and felt the texture of each strand against the bristles. She arranged the perfume bottles on the vanity and noted the way the light caught in their colored glass. She touched the trunk and felt its warmth calling to her like a promise or a threat. Helena left the house that afternoon to pay calls on her friends, leaving strict instructions about how the bedroom should be cleaned in her absence. Sarah worked methodically through the tasks, but her mind was elsewhere, turning over the decision she knew she would have to make soon. As she dusted the mirror, she looked once more for her reflection and found, as always, only absence. The mirror showed the room, showed the trunk beside it, showed everything except Sarah herself. And in that absence, Sarah saw the truth of her position more clearly than she ever had before. She was already gone. Slavery had already erased her in all the ways that mattered. Her thoughts, her feelings, her desires, her very selfhood, all of these were considered irrelevant by the world she lived in. She was not a person to people like Helena Pennington. She was a tool, a possession, a thing to be used and discarded when no longer useful. The mirror was simply reflecting this truth, showing the world as it actually was rather than maintaining the polite fiction that Sarah was a human being deserving of acknowledgement. The realization did not make Sarah angry, though anger would have been justified. Instead, it filled her with a profound sadness and a strange kind of acceptance. If she was already erased, if her existence was already denied by the world around her, then perhaps the trunk's offer was not erasure at all, but rather a form of truth-telling. Perhaps stepping into that space would be an act of honesty, an acknowledgement of what had already been done to her, a refusal to continue the pretense that she was participating in life when she was really just being consumed by it. Sarah spent the rest of the afternoon preparing. She said goodbye to the people she cared about without telling them it was goodbye. She found Esther in the kitchen and embraced her tightly, memorizing the feel of her friend's arms around her. She sought out Moses in the garden and helped him plant bulbs for the spring flowers, pressing her hands into the cold earth and feeling its weight and texture. She visited the quarters where she had been born and stood for a long time looking at the small building where her mother had lived and died, imprinting the site on her memory. As evening fell, Sarah returned to the main house and climbed the stairs to Helena's bedroom one final time. Her mistress had not yet returned from her social calls, and the room was empty and quiet. Sarah lit the candles around the vanity and stood before the mirror, looking at the space where her reflection should have been. She took off her apron, the simple garment that marked her as a servant, and folded it carefully. Then she unlocked the trunk and opened the lid. The glow from within was stronger now, bright enough to cast shadows on the walls. Sarah placed her folded apron inside the trunk, laying it atop the silks and jewels that had been more valued than her humanity. Then she took the journal from its hiding place and read once more Marguerite's warning. Once someone enters the trunk's embrace, they step outside the world and cannot return, unless they can remember why they wished to be part of it in the first place. Remember why she wished to be part of the world. Sarah thought about this as she stood beside the trunk, feeling its warmth and hearing its silent call. Why had she wished to be part of this world? What was there in it that made existence worthwhile despite all the pain? She thought of Esther's laughter, of Moses's kindness, of the jasmine smell and the singing and the small stolen moments of beauty. She thought of her mother, whom she barely remembered, and of the strength it must have taken for Ruth to bring a child into a world where that child would be born enslaved. She thought of all the people who had survived slavery and all the people who would come after her, and she understood that her existence mattered not because the world acknowledged it, but because she herself chose to acknowledge it, chose to insist that she was here and real and human despite everything that said otherwise. But even understanding this, Sarah could not find the strength to turn away from the trunk. The weight of her life was too heavy, the daily erasure too complete. She had reached the limit of what she could bear, and the trunk offered rest, offered escape, offered an end to suffering. Perhaps that was enough. Perhaps she did not need to justify her choice or prove her strength by enduring the unendurable. Perhaps choosing to step out of the world was its own kind of courage, its own form of resistance against the forces that had tried to crush her. Sarah removed her shoes and placed them beside the trunk. Then, moving with deliberate slowness, she climbed into the trunk itself. It was larger inside than it should have been, its dimensions somehow expanded to accommodate her body. The strange thick air enveloped her like water, supporting her weight, making her feel weightless and free. She lay down inside the trunk, curling on her side, and looked up at the room beyond the trunk's edge. The candlelight seemed very far away suddenly, as though she were looking at it through a great distance or through many layers of glass. Sarah reached up and touched the inside of the trunk's lid. She felt the smooth wood beneath her palm and pressed her hand flat against it, leaving her mark, leaving evidence that she had been here, that she had existed, that she had chosen this. Then with her other hand she pulled the lid down over herself. It closed with a soft click as the lock engaged from within, and Sarah found herself in darkness. But it was not a frightening darkness. It was warm and soft and somehow luminous, as though the light came from within her own body rather than from any external source. Sarah felt herself beginning to dissolve, to spread out beyond the boundaries of her physical form. She felt her consciousness expanding, or perhaps just letting go of the tight focus that defined individual existence. She heard music, though there was no source for the sound, a melody that seemed familiar though she could not name it. She smelled jasmine and honeysuckle and her mother's hair and the earth after rain. Time stopped meaning anything. Sarah floated in the space between heartbeats, outside the flow of moments, suspended in an eternal now that held no pain and no fear and no suffering. She felt herself forgetting the details of her life, the sharp edges of memory growing soft and indistinct. She forgot Helena's cruelty and the weight of servitude and the mirror that had refused to reflect her. She forgot names and faces and the feel of her own body. She became less and less until she was hardly anything at all, just a faint wisp of consciousness drifting in a warm darkness, almost ready to let go completely. But just before she disappeared entirely, something pulled her back from the edge of dissolution, a memory sharp and clear, cutting through the pleasant fog of forgetting. She remembered Esther's face, remembered the way her friend had laughed at something Sarah had said, remembered the warmth of human connection and the simple fact that she had mattered to someone, that her existence had made a difference however small in someone else's life. And with that memory came others, flooding back in a rush. Moses teaching her about plants, her mother singing to her when she was small, the taste of fresh bread, the sight of sunrise over the harbor, the feeling of grass beneath her bare feet. Sarah remembered why she had wished to be part of the world, and the memory was a chain that bound her to existence even as she floated in the timeless space of the trunk. She could not return. Marguerite's journal had been clear about that, but she could not disappear entirely either. She remained suspended between being and non-being, existing but not present, aware but not embodied, trapped in the space she had chosen as an escape but which had become a different kind of prison. In the bedroom, Helena Pennington returned home to find Sarah's shoes beside the trunk and no sign of the girl herself. She called for Sarah, her voice growing sharp with irritation when no answer came. She searched the house, questioning the other servants, sending messengers to the quarters, growing increasingly angry at what she perceived as deliberate disobedience. When Sarah could not be found anywhere, Helena assumed she had run away, an act of defiance that infuriated the mistress more than any other transgression could have. Benjamin Pennington posted notices offering a reward for Sarah's return. He questioned the other enslaved people harshly, certain that someone must know where the girl had gone. But no one had seen Sarah leave, and no one could explain her disappearance. It was as though she had simply vanished into air. 3 days after Sarah disappeared, Helena finally thought to check the trunk. She found it locked, which was unusual because she always left it unlocked unless she was leaving the house for an extended period. She retrieved her spare key from her jewelry box and opened the trunk, expecting perhaps to find that Sarah had hidden something inside. But all she found was Sarah's apron folded neatly, and when she pulled it out, she saw the handprint pressed deep into the inside of the lid, as though someone had pushed against it with tremendous force. Helena stared at that handprint for a long time, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the February cold. There was something deeply unsettling about it, something that suggested Sarah had been inside the trunk, which was impossible because the trunk was too small to hold a person. And yet the handprint was there, undeniable, a final mark left by the girl who had disappeared. Helena closed the trunk and locked it again. She told Benjamin about the apron and the handprint, but he dismissed her concerns. The girl had obviously left the apron behind as some kind of message, he said, and the handprint was probably just a mark that had been there all along that Helena was only now noticing. Sarah was gone, run away to who knew where, and that was the end of it. He would not waste more money searching for one enslaved girl when he could simply purchase another. But Helena could not let it go. She found herself standing beside the trunk at odd hours, staring at it, sometimes pressing her own hand against the lid as though trying to feel whatever Sarah had felt. The mirror beside the trunk began to disturb her as well. She started to fancy that it did not reflect things quite accurately, that there were shadows in it that should not be there, movements at the edge of vision that vanished when she looked directly at them. The other servants noticed that something was wrong in Helena's bedroom. They spoke in whispers about strange sounds they heard when they passed the door at night, soft crying or knocking that seemed to come from inside the room even when Helena was asleep. Esther, who grieved Sarah's disappearance with an ache that never quite healed, swore that one night when she was cleaning the room she had heard Sarah's voice calling faintly from somewhere very far away, begging to be let out. The trunk remained in Helena's bedroom for another year before she finally could not stand it any longer. She had Benjamin remove it and the mirror both, selling them to a merchant who shipped them north to Baltimore. She replaced them with new furniture, ordinary pieces with no strange histories, but she never again felt comfortable in that room. She would wake sometimes in the middle of the night with the absolute conviction that someone was standing beside her bed, that Sarah had returned and was watching her sleep with dark, accusing eyes. The years passed, and the story of Sarah's disappearance became a ghost tale told among the enslaved people of Charleston. They said that Sarah had found a way to escape slavery more completely than running away could ever have achieved, that she had stepped outside the world itself and taken her freedom in the only form available to her. Some said it was a warning against despair, that Sarah's fate showed what happened when hope was abandoned. Others said it was an inspiration, proof that even in the most impossible circumstances there were still choices, still ways to resist, still methods of saying no to the forces that sought to crush human dignity. The trunk and mirror passed through many hands over the decades that followed. Sometimes they stayed together, sometimes they were separated, but they always found their way back to each other eventually, drawn together by whatever connection the French craftsman had forged between them. People who owned them reported strange occurrences, reflections that did not quite match reality, sounds that came from inside locked trunks, a feeling of being watched by someone who was not entirely present. And Sarah remained suspended in the space between heartbeats, aware but not free, existing but not living, held in place by her memories of why she had wished to be part of the world even as she floated outside it. She could not return, but she could not completely disappear either. She became a ghost in the most literal sense, a consciousness untethered from body and time, drifting through a space that was neither life nor death but something else entirely, something the living could barely comprehend. On certain nights, when the moon hung full and the veil between worlds grew thin, those who owned the trunk could hear soft crying coming from within it, and sometimes a voice calling out in pain and longing, "Let me out! Please, someone let me out!" But the trunk remained locked, and Sarah remained trapped, a girl who had sought escape and found instead a prison more complete than any her masters could have devised, paying forever the price of a choice made in desperation and despair. The Civil War came and went, and slavery was finally abolished in law, if not always in practice. The trunk and mirror survived the conflict, protected by owners who valued their beauty without knowing their history. They passed into the 20th century and then the 21st, antiques whose origins were largely forgotten, whose dark purpose was unknown to those who possessed them. But Sarah remained inside the trunk, or perhaps more accurately, she remained in the space the trunk accessed, the realm between moments where she had chosen to flee. Sometimes people would buy the trunk at estate sales or antique markets, drawn by its beauty and craftsmanship. They would take it home and place it in their bedrooms or living rooms, never suspecting what it contained. And sometimes, late at night, they would hear that faint crying or feel a cold spot near the trunk that no amount of heating could dispel. Some of them would open the trunk and find nothing inside but emptiness. Others would leave it locked, unwilling to confront whatever might be found within. The mirror, when it was paired with the trunk, would sometimes show strange things. People reported seeing figures in the reflection that were not present in the room, shadows that moved with purposeful intelligence, a young woman's face that appeared for just a moment before vanishing. These visions were usually dismissed as tricks of light or imagination because to accept them as real would require accepting that the world contained mysteries and horrors beyond normal comprehension. But the enslaved people of Charleston and their descendants knew better. They remembered Sarah White and the story of how she had climbed into a trunk one February evening in 1833 and never came out. They told the story to their children and grandchildren, keeping alive the memory of a girl who had been so thoroughly erased by slavery that even her reflection had disappeared, who had been given a choice between endless suffering and self-negation, and had chosen the latter because it was the only choice available to her. The story became a reminder of what slavery had cost, not just in terms of labor and lives, but in terms of human souls pushed beyond the limits of endurance. It became a memorial to all those who had been disappeared by the system of bondage, whether literally like Sarah or figuratively through the daily violence that denied their humanity. And it became a warning about the price of despair, about what happens when people are pushed so far into darkness that even escape becomes a trap. Sarah herself, floating in the timeless space between heartbeats, no longer remembered much of her life. The details had faded over the years, worn away by time and distance until only the emotional core remained. The memory of suffering, the moment of choice, the sensation of letting go. She had forgotten Helena's face and the layout of the Pennington house. She had forgotten Esther's laughter and Moses's kindness. She had forgotten the smell of jasmine and the taste of stolen sweets. But she remembered the feeling of being erased, of being denied acknowledgement and humanity. She remembered the mirror that had refused to reflect her and the trunk that had promised escape. She remembered the moment when she had pulled the lid closed over herself, sealing her fate. And she remembered the handprint she had left pressed into the wood, her final mark on the physical world, her proof that she had existed and that her existence had mattered even if the world insisted otherwise. And so Sarah remained, a ghost trapped not by chains or violence but by her own choice, a choice made in desperation but a choice nonetheless. She existed in the space between existence and non-existence, unable to fully disappear because memory bound her to the world, unable to return because the door she had passed through only opened one way. She was Charleston's most tragic ghost, a girl who had sought freedom and found only a different kind of prison, who had tried to escape erasure and had instead made it permanent. The trunk and mirror continue to exist somewhere in the world, passed from owner to owner, accumulating stories and reports of strange phenomena. People who are sensitive to such things can feel Sarah's presence when they are near the trunk, can sense the grief and longing that emanates from the space it accesses. Sometimes they leave offerings beside it, flowers or candles or small tokens of remembrance. Sometimes they speak to Sarah, telling her that she is not forgotten, that her story is still told, that the injustice done to her is acknowledged even across the gulf of centuries. But Sarah cannot respond, cannot reach across the boundary that separates her from the living world. She remains trapped in her chosen refuge, neither alive nor dead, neither present nor absent, suspended forever in the moment of her disappearance. She is the girl who locked herself in the mirror trunk and never came out, who chose erasure over suffering and found that erasure carried its own unbearable suffering, who sought escape and discovered that there is no escape from memory and consciousness, that the self persists even when everything else is stripped away. Her story remains a testament to the cruelty of slavery and the impossible choices it forced upon those it enslaved. It reminds us that every system of oppression pushes some people beyond the limits of human endurance, that some souls are damaged so deeply that healing becomes impossible, that the price of injustice is measured not just in bodies and years, but in the fracturing of human consciousness itself. Sarah White paid that price, and she continues to pay it. Locked forever in her trunk of mirrors and memories, a ghost who cannot die because she never quite finished living. A girl who sought freedom in disappearance and found only an eternity of in-between. This is the story of Sarah of Charleston, the enslaved girl who climbed into a trunk one winter evening in 1833 seeking escape from unbearable suffering and who remains there still, suspended in a space outside time, neither fully gone nor able to return. Her reflection disappeared from the mirror because the world had already erased her in all the ways that mattered. Her handprint remained pressed into the trunk's lid because even in choosing disappearance, she insisted on leaving a mark, on proving that she had existed and that her existence had meaning. She is remembered in whispers and ghost stories, in the tales passed down through generations, in the cold spots and strange sounds that emanate from an antique trunk that most people see as merely beautiful rather than tragic. And on certain nights, when the conditions are right and the veil between worlds grows thin, people near the trunk can still hear Sarah crying softly, begging to be released from the prison she created for herself, asking someone, anyone, to remember her fully enough to call her back from the space between heartbeats where she has floated for nearly 2 centuries. But no one knows how to free her, because the key to her prison is not made of brass or iron, but of memory and choice, and those locks cannot be picked by any tool the living world possesses. Sarah White remains locked in her trunk, and the trunk remains sealed, and the mirror beside it continues to reflect everything except the girl who most needed to be seen. This is the price of erasure taken to its ultimate conclusion. This is what happens when human beings are denied their humanity so completely that disappearance seems preferable to existence. This is the ghost story that Charleston tells itself in the dark. The reminder of slavery's cost measured not in dollars or labor, but in the fracturing of souls and the imprisonment of consciousness in spaces between reality and void. Sarah sought freedom and found entrapment. She sought escape and found permanence. She sought to stop existing and discovered that existence cannot be abandoned, only transformed into something strange and terrible and eternally lonely. The trunk waits still, in some house or shop or storage unit, containing within it or perhaps accessing through its dimensions a space where Sarah White floats outside time, remembering and forgetting, being and not being, trapped forever by a choice she made when she was just 17 years old and could see no other path forward. Her story serves as memorial and warning both, a reminder that injustice leaves marks that time cannot heal, and creates wounds that persist beyond the grave, beyond life itself, in spaces where suffering takes on new forms and loses none of its power to cause pain. In the decades immediately following Sarah's disappearance, the trunk traveled a circuitous path through the American South and beyond. After Helena Pennington sold it to the Baltimore merchant in 1834, it passed into the hands of a wealthy banker's wife who placed it in her daughter's room. The daughter, a girl named Caroline who was about Sarah's age when she disappeared, began experiencing vivid nightmares within a week of the trunk's arrival. She dreamed of being trapped in small, dark spaces, of pressing her hands against wooden walls that would not yield, of calling out for help that never came. The dreams grew so intense that Caroline's parents consulted doctors who could find nothing physically wrong with the girl. Eventually, the family attributed the nightmares to nervous disposition and married Caroline off to a merchant from Philadelphia, sending the trunk along as part of her dowry. In Philadelphia, the trunk resided in Caroline's new home for 3 years. During that time, Caroline gave birth to 2 children and slowly stopped having the nightmares, though she never felt entirely comfortable around the trunk. She kept it locked always and avoided looking at it directly when she entered the room where it sat. Her husband noticed that his wife seemed relieved when a fire swept through their neighborhood in 1841, and they were forced to evacuate their home. Though the house survived with minimal damage, Caroline insisted they sell most of their furniture and start fresh. The trunk was among the items sold, purchased by an antique dealer who specialized in French imports. The dealer kept the trunk in his shop for nearly a year before finding a buyer. During that time, several customers expressed interest in the piece, drawn by its obvious quality and the intricate mother-of-pearl work on its lid. But each potential buyer who opened the trunk to examine its interior reported feeling suddenly unwell, experiencing waves of nausea or dizziness that made them abandon the purchase. The dealer began to wonder if there might be something wrong with the wood itself, perhaps some toxic finish or varnish that produced fumes when the trunk was opened. He had the piece examined by a carpenter who found nothing unusual about its construction or materials. Eventually, a professor of antiquities from the University of Pennsylvania purchased both the trunk and the mirror, fascinated by the craftsmanship and determined to research their origins. Professor Nathaniel Green spent months corresponding with contacts in France, trying to trace the maker and learn more about these unusual pieces. His inquiries eventually led him to Marguerite Duchamp's relatives, who confirmed that her late husband had indeed created such objects, and that Marguerite herself had written extensively about her concerns regarding their purpose. But the journal that Sarah had discovered was never mentioned, and the relatives claimed that most of Marguerite's papers had been lost or destroyed after her death. Professor Green placed the trunk and mirror in his study, where they remained for 15 years. During this time, he wrote several scholarly articles about French decorative arts and occasionally mentioned the pieces in his lectures. His students sometimes remarked that the professor seemed to age rapidly during this period, growing gaunt and distant, spending long hours alone in his study staring at the mirror or sitting beside the trunk with his head bowed as though listening to something only he could hear. His wife worried about his mental state but attributed his behavior to the stress of academic life and the disappointments of a career that had never quite achieved the recognition he had hoped for. In 1856, Professor Green died suddenly at the age of 52. His death was attributed to heart failure, though the doctor who examined him noted that the professor's expression in death was one of profound sadness rather than the peace usually associated with cardiac events. His widow sold his collection of antiquities to settle debts, and the trunk and mirror were once again separated, purchased by different buyers at the estate sale. The trunk went to a family in Boston, while the mirror traveled to a collector in New York. For the next 30 years, the trunk and mirror existed apart, passing through various hands, accumulating their own separate stories of strange occurrences and unsettled owners. But in 1886, through a series of coincidences that seemed too purposeful to be entirely random, both pieces ended up in the same estate sale in Charleston, South Carolina. A local historian purchased them, recognizing the French craftsmanship and hoping to display them in the small museum he was establishing to preserve the city's cultural heritage. He placed them together in a room dedicated to the antebellum period, positioning the mirror above a reproduction vanity with the trunk sitting beside it, inadvertently recreating the arrangement that had existed in Helena Pennington's bedroom more than 50 years earlier. The museum opened to the public in 1887. And the room containing the trunk and mirror quickly became known among the staff as the Troubled Gallery. Guards assigned to that section reported hearing soft weeping late at night when the museum was closed. Visitors sometimes complained of feeling watched or experiencing sudden drops in temperature when they stood near the trunk. One elderly woman, a former enslaved person who had been freed after the war, stopped in front of the trunk and began to cry, saying that she could hear a girl calling out from inside it, begging for someone named Esther to help her. The museum director, intrigued by these reports, began to research the trunk's history. His inquiries eventually led him to the surviving records of the Pennington household, where he discovered the story of Sarah White's disappearance in 1833. He found Benjamin Pennington's notices offering a reward for her return, found mentions of the incident in the diaries of other Charleston families, found references to the strange circumstances of her vanishing. He even tracked down descendants of people who had been enslaved in the Pennington household and recorded their oral histories, preserving stories that had been passed down through generations about the girl who had climbed into a trunk and never emerged. Armed with this information, the museum director created a small placard to accompany the trunk and mirror, explaining their connection to Sarah White's story. He wrote about the mystery of her disappearance and the persistent legends that she was somehow trapped within or connected to the trunk. The placard was meant to add historical interest to the display, but its effect was more unsettling than educational. Visitors who read about Sarah's fate often reported feeling deeply disturbed, and some refused to enter the room at all after learning the story. Parents complained that their children had nightmares after visiting the museum, dreams of being locked in dark places from which they could not escape. Within 5 years, the museum director decided to remove the trunk and mirror from public display. He stored them in the museum's basement, where they remained for decades, occasionally loaned out to other institutions for special exhibitions but never permanently displayed again. Each institution that borrowed them reported similar phenomena: unexplained sounds, temperature anomalies, visitors who became emotional or unwell in their presence. By the early 20th century, the pieces had developed such a reputation that few museums were willing to exhibit them, and they spent most of their time in storage. During the 1920s, a wealthy collector of occult objects learned about the trunk and mirror and purchased them from the Charleston Museum for a substantial sum. Harrison Blackwood was a man obsessed with what he called the thin places, locations or objects where the boundary between the physical world and other realms grew permeable. He believed that certain artifacts could serve as doorways or anchors, connecting our reality to dimensions beyond normal perception. The trunk and mirror, with their documented history of strange occurrences and their connection to Sarah's disappearance, seemed to him like perfect examples of such objects. Blackwood installed the trunk and mirror in a specially prepared room in his mansion outside Boston. He spent years attempting to communicate with whatever presence inhabited or was connected to the trunk. Using methods drawn from spiritualism, ceremonial magic, and his own invented techniques, he kept detailed journals of his experiments, recording instances when he heard voices coming from the trunk, moments when the mirror showed reflections that did not match the physical room, sensations of being touched by invisible hands. He became convinced that Sarah White was indeed trapped in some form within or beyond the trunk, and that it might be possible to free her, or at least to communicate with her meaningfully. But Blackwood's attempts to reach Sarah only seemed to intensify her torment. On nights when he performed his rituals, the crying from the trunk grew louder, more desperate, and the cold spots around it expanded to fill the entire room. Objects would fall from shelves without apparent cause. The mirror's reflection would show shadowy figures moving through spaces where no one stood. Blackwood began to experience disturbing dreams in which he found himself trapped in endless darkness, pressing against barriers he could not see, calling out in a voice that was not his own. He recognized too late that his experiments were not helping Sarah, but rather strengthening whatever prison held her, drawing energy from his attempts at contact to reinforce the walls between her realm and his. In 1928, Harrison Blackwood was found dead in the room that housed the trunk and mirror. He was discovered slumped against the trunk itself, his hand pressed flat against its lid in the same position as the handprint Sarah had left nearly a century earlier. The official cause of death was determined to be stroke, but those who found him noted that his face bore an expression of absolute terror. and his fingers had left deep scratches in the trunk's wood as though he had been trying desperately to push something closed or to prevent something from getting out. His journals, when they were eventually examined, revealed a man who had descended into obsession and possibly madness, convinced in his final entries that he had made a terrible mistake in attempting to interact with the trunk, that he had awakened something that should have remained dormant. Blackwood's estate was liquidated, and the trunk and mirror were once again sold separately. The trunk was purchased by a dealer in curiosities who kept it for only 3 months before experiencing such profound disturbances in his shop that he donated it to a small historical society in Maryland. The mirror went to a private collector in England who displayed it for several years before his own mysterious death, after which it was returned to the United States through a series of inheritance transfers. By the 1950s, both pieces had made their way back to the American South, though they remained separated by several hundred miles. The second half of the 20th century saw the trunk and mirror pass through numerous hands, their reputation preceding them in whispers among collectors and dealers. Most people who acquired them kept them for only short periods before the disturbances they caused became too unsettling to bear. The pattern was consistent: crying sounds, cold spots, feelings of being watched, nightmares of confinement and suffocation. Some owners reported seeing a young woman's face in the mirror appearing for just a moment before fading away. Others claimed to feel hands touching them when they stood near the trunk. Gentle pushes or pulls as though someone were trying to get their attention. In the 1980s, a paranormal research team gained permission to study the trunk for a weekend, conducting various tests and recordings in an attempt to document the phenomena associated with it. Their equipment registered several anomalies: electromagnetic fluctuations, unexplained temperature variations, and audio recordings that seemed to capture a woman's voice, speaking or crying, though the words were too distorted to make out clearly. One member of the team, a psychic medium, claimed to have made contact with Sarah's consciousness. She described Sarah as being aware but confused, unable to fully understand her own state of existence, trapped in a space that was neither life nor death but something altogether different. The medium reported that Sarah was lonely beyond measure, that she had been alone in her prison for so long that she could barely remember what it felt like to be part of the human world, but that some core part of her consciousness still reached out desperately for connection, for acknowledgement, for rescue. The research team's findings were published in a small journal devoted to paranormal studies, adding academic documentation to the legends that had always surrounded the trunk. But documentation did nothing to change Sarah's situation or to free her from her confinement. If anything, the attention seemed to make things worse, as though being observed and analyzed added another layer of suffering to her already unbearable isolation. The owner of the trunk at the time, frightened by the intensity of the phenomena during the research team's investigation, immediately put the piece up for sale and vowed never to have anything to do with allegedly haunted objects again. By the turn of the 21st century, the trunk and mirror had both ended up in the hands of dealers who specialized in items with dark or troubled histories. These dealers catered to a specific clientele: people who were drawn to the macabre, who sought out objects with supernatural reputations, who wanted to own pieces of darkness. The trunk was sold to a man who collected artifacts related to slavery and its aftermath, viewing them as important reminders of historical injustice. He treated the trunk with a respect that previous owners had not always shown, acknowledging its connection to Sarah White and the suffering she represented. He placed it in a climate-controlled room and allowed researchers and descendants of enslaved people to visit and pay their respects. It was during this period that the trunk and mirror were finally reunited, brought together again nearly a century after they had last been displayed side by side. The owner, a man named Marcus Washington, whose own ancestors had been enslaved in South Carolina, purchased the mirror specifically because he had learned of its connection to the trunk. He believed that the pieces belonged together, that their separation had been a kind of additional violation of Sarah's memory. He hoped that reuniting them might bring some measure of peace, though he had no clear idea of how this could be accomplished or what peace might mean for someone in Sarah's incomprehensible situation. When the mirror was positioned above the trunk, recreating once again the arrangement from Helena Pennington's bedroom, the phenomena intensified dramatically. The crying grew loud enough to be heard throughout the house. The cold spots became so severe that frost formed on the windows even in summer. Visitors reported seeing full apparitions now. Not just fleeting faces in the mirror, but the complete figure of a young woman standing beside the trunk, looking at them with eyes full of desperate longing before fading away. Marcus Washington documented everything carefully, maintaining detailed records of each occurrence, each manifestation, each sign that Sarah's presence remained tied to these objects after nearly 2 centuries. Marcus also did something that previous owners had not done. He told Sarah's story publicly and extensively. He created a website dedicated to her memory, sharing the historical records he had uncovered, the oral histories he had collected, the research that had been done. He argued that Sarah White should be remembered not just as a ghost story or a curiosity, but as a real person who had lived and suffered under slavery, who had been pushed to a point of desperation so extreme that she had chosen to remove herself from existence rather than continue enduring what was being done to her. He spoke at museums and universities, at gatherings of descendants of enslaved people, anywhere he could find an audience willing to listen. He insisted that Sarah's story mattered, that her choice had meaning, that her continued presence through the trunk and mirror was a kind of testimony that should not be ignored or dismissed. The response to Marcus's efforts was complex and sometimes contradictory. Some people praised him for keeping Sarah's memory alive and for contextualizing her story within the larger history of slavery and its psychological devastations. Others criticized him for what they saw as exploitation, arguing that he was profiting from Sarah's suffering by charging admission to see the trunk and mirror or by selling books and giving paid lectures about her story. Marcus struggled with these criticisms, understanding their validity, while also believing sincerely that what he was doing served an important purpose. He gave much of the money he earned to organizations supporting descendants of enslaved people and to historical preservation efforts, trying to ensure that his involvement with Sarah's story created some positive outcomes even if it could not change her own tragic fate. As the 21st century progressed and the trunk and mirror remained in Marcus Washington's care, the phenomena associated with them began to change in subtle ways. The crying became less frequent but somehow more poignant when it occurred. The apparitions appeared less often but seemed more solid, more present when they did manifest. Marcus wondered if the attention he had brought to Sarah's story, the public acknowledgement of her existence and suffering, might be having some effect on her consciousness trapped in that space between worlds. He had no way to know for certain, but he continued his work of remembrance, believing that even if he could not free Sarah, he could at least ensure that she was not forgotten, that her story continued to be told, that the injustice done to her remained visible across the gulf of centuries. This is the story of Sarah of Charleston, the girl who climbed into a trunk seeking escape and who remains there still, neither dead nor alive but suspended in between, paying forever the price of a freedom that turned out to be just another form of bondage, calling out across the centuries for a release that may never come. Her trunk and mirror continue their journey through time, bearing witness to her suffering and to the system that created such suffering, serving as monuments to all those who were broken by slavery's cruelty and to the impossible choices that oppression forces upon the oppressed. Sarah White was 17 years old when she disappeared, and she has been 17 for nearly 200 years, frozen in the moment of her greatest desperation, unable to move forward or back, waiting in darkness for a dawn that may never arrive. Her story is America's story, a reminder of foundations built on suffering and of debts that can never fully be repaid, of ghosts that will not rest because they were never given the dignity of a proper ending. She remains, and her remaining is itself a kind of haunting, a persistent presence that refuses to let the past stay buried, that insists on being acknowledged and remembered and mourned.